This is our platform for the meeting because it's the most secure option that we have available, and it minimizes the chance of having technical issues. That being said, it's a bit of a trade-off, and it does have limitations. The main one being that it doesn't easily allow for attendees to see each other. So, we're sorry about that, but we've gone with the reliability here, and we have other ways in which we're going to make this an engaging dialogue. We'll talk more about the platform in a few minutes. I do just want to make sure folks know that there's a Q&A function, though. If you have any issues, particularly of a technical nature, you can use that. So right away, I do want to let you know that we have Spanish and Portuguese language translation services available tonight. And in a minute, you may not see it right away, but you'll see the graphic on the slide here that shows at the bottom of your screen in a moment. You should see a globe on the far right, a globe icon that says interpretation. And even if you choose to proceed in English, you should make a selection there. So select a language. And like I said, we have our Q&A function that you can use if you're having any technical issues or if you need assistance selecting a language. And we will be posting translated recordings after the fact. We appreciate for people to speak slowly to aid in the translation. And if anyone would like to have slides in another language, please let us know. We're happy to provide a translation of those. And we welcome people sharing comments in their preferred language, and we will translate those. And I would like to, at this time, introduce our translators who will provide information in Spanish and Portuguese.
Buenas noches a todos. Quiero, antes de continuar adelante, dejarles saber que tienen dos opciones. Hay el Q&A para cualquier problema técnico o preguntas que hayan. También les queremos dejar saber que están los servicios de interpretación de idiomas. Vamos a tener español y portugués. En un momento van a ver el globo que aparece, va a aparecer en la parte baja y pueden seleccionar, aun cuando estén escuchando en inglés. Y luego de eso se van a poner estas opiniones en el sitio web en español y en portugués.
Boa noite, obrigada por esperarem com paciência até que nós tomemos todas as providências. Vocês, essa noite, terão disponíveis os serviços de língua em espanhol e português. Vocês deverão ouvir, a princípio, primeiro espanhol, depois português. Mais à frente, se vocês tiverem qualquer dúvida em relação ao que estiver acontecendo com o seminário ou o seu computador, vocês podem usar a função Q e A para fazer perguntas e obter assistência, e logo em breve vocês terão a opção de clicar no globo, que é um ícone que vai aparecer na base da sua tela, para escolher se vão ouvir a interpretação em espanhol ou em português. Muito obrigada.
Thank you. Thank you. And you should now see the globe on the bottom of your screen. So thank you. So we have 186 participants right now. We had over 200 people register for this meeting tonight, and I can't tell you how grateful and frankly inspired that makes us feel. It just speaks volumes about the importance of forests, how deeply we all care about them, and how committed we are to fighting climate change. Many of you, I believe, attended our first meeting back in September, and that was a really thoughtful and wide-ranging dialogue where we heard so many different ideas and perspectives, and we're looking forward to hearing more tonight. So fighting climate change is the centerpiece of the Healy Driscoll administration, and we are striving to meet this pivotal moment in history and seizing the opportunity that comes with the incredible challenges that we're facing. And that is why we have an aggressive nation-leading whole of government approach to climate change. And when the news and recent climate assessments and some scientific studies that were just released is very, very sobering. And it makes us recommit and focus on this work that much more. So forests are critical to realizing our net zero carbon emissions commitments. in reaching our goals. We are literally counting on them for the carbon drawdown and storage they provide, and of course for the resilience that they offer for the frequent and more intense storms that we're already seeing. So with this in mind, the Forests as Climate Solutions Initiative is bringing an elevated focus on forests and climate, and ensuring that our stewardship and our management decisions are informed by the best climate science, and that we're using all the tools in the toolbox and thinking broadly about how we keep our forests vital for the long term. So we are, mindful of the many benefits that forests provide to people and the environment. And we also know that there are many different viewpoints about them. And it's really important that we hear all perspectives. And that's a lot of what this meeting is about tonight. So we really value your time and appreciate that you are spending some of it with us this evening. So next, I'm going to do some introductions and just walk through the agenda. So first, let me introduce our panelists. Kurt Gertner is our Assistant Secretary for Environmental Policy with Energy and Environmental Affairs. Caroline Higley is our Assistant Secretary for Strategic Initiatives and Agency Coordination. Dunbar Carpenter is our Manager of Land Carbon Science and Analysis at EEA. And then Susan Podsiba is our consultant and facilitator from Podsiba Policy Mediation. I also want to acknowledge some other state leaders who are planning to be with us for some or all of tonight. So our Climate Chief, Melissa Hoffer, our Department of Fish and Game Commissioner, Tom O'Shea, Department of Conservation and Recreation Commissioner, Brian Arrigo, our Division of Fisheries and Wildlife Director, Mark Tisa. Was also pleased to see that our Division of Fisheries and Wildlife Board Chair, Stephen Sears, and our DCR Stewardship Council Chair, Jack Buckley, registered to be here tonight. So we really appreciate that. So the purpose of our meeting tonight is to share updates on the Forests as Climate Solutions Initiative. In particular, we want to talk to you about the work of the Climate Forestry Committee in developing climate-oriented guidelines. And for those who might be joining for the first time tonight, we'll tell you a little bit more about what that is in a minute. But the idea is we're giving you a window in, and we're reporting out with some substance on what the Climate Forestry Committee has been thinking about, some themes that they have sort of come together around, and some content. And so that, is all informing the development of the guidelines, and we really want to hear your reactions and thoughts about that tonight. So I also want to acknowledge that some members of the Climate Forestry Committee of Experts who are advising us on this effort are here tonight listening in, and I want to thank them for all of their time. So for taking the time to be here tonight and for the incredible commitment that they've made to this process. We owe them a debt of gratitude for sure. And you may remember, those who were at the first session we had in September, that we had members of the committee who were able to listen in on that session too. And after, we were able to provide them with the written comments, an overall summary, and then a link to a recording of the meeting so that they had those materials for their consideration. So onto the agenda. We've checked off a couple of things already. We've been going through the introductions. We're going to talk about the Forests as Climate Solutions Initiative. We're going to give you an update on the different branches, and I'll tell you what that means more in a minute. I said already, we're going to talk about the Climate Forestry Committee and its work advising the state on climate-oriented guidelines development. And then we're going to talk about, we'll set up the logistics for the public input part of the meeting. And then we're going to have, as we've had in past meetings, an opportunity for people to speak to up to 3 minutes. And we'll tell you more about that. So I would say, as was before, I think we have a lot of people registered, so appreciate people in advance being mindful of time as you think about your comments. And we also have a survey form that we're using that we'll talk about as well. That's a really directed way for you to give us input that will help inform the process. So we will also we will take in everything that we hear tonight. We will look at written comments after the fact. And so there's a lot of ways in which you can make your voice heard to us. So let's go to the next slide. I do want to just give a little bit of context too about state lands and private forests. This initiative is about all forests in Massachusetts. So whether they're municipally owned by land trusts, stewarded by the state, or under private ownership, we are so fortunate that 57% of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts is forested land. Most of that is privately owned. About 500,000 acres are under the care and stewardship of our Division of Fisheries and Wildlife and DCR. DCR has 2 divisions that manage forests, our State Parks and Recreation Division and our Water Supply Protection that manages the land around the MWRA watersheds, around the MWRA water system. So the Forests Climate Solutions Initiative, I've said already, we're really focused on fighting climate change and everything that we're doing in state government. And in particular, we have, as part of our clean energy and climate plan, a commitment to protect 40% of the Commonwealth by 2050, and much of that will be forested land. So in doing so, we're thinking about how do we best take care of our forests? How do we focus on their capacity to remove and store carbon? So that's a major area of focus that guides our work. We also promote sustainable forest management practices and local wood products. We know we reduce our carbon footprint when we source and use wood that is locally or regionally based. And the components of the initiative are listed here. And I'm going to talk about those. So why don't we go ahead and go to the next slide. So we call them the branches of the Forests Climate Solutions Initiative. And so let's go to the next one. Here we go. So I'm just going to give just very sort of high level overview. So the first one is around conservation. So accelerating the pace of permanent forest conservation across the state, but also reducing the conversion of forests to other uses. And so there are a lot of elements to that, but it really is foundational to our land conservation strategy for the state. And we rely on a lot of partners and a lot of landowners to help us carry that out. As part of this initiative, we are also making a commitment to expand forest reserves. So forests that are managed passively, where as much as possible, natural processes, nature is in charge, we limit human intervention. So we do this because of the carbon benefits and letting the forest naturally grow old, but also there are a range of habitat, biodiversity, and other human values that reserves offer. We have already over 100,000 acres of forest reserves on state lands, and our commitment is to expand a network of reserves across the state. So on public lands, but importantly on private lands and lands owned by others, such as municipalities and land trusts. So I just want to note that this branch of the initiative has been thinking about capacity building. And for example, talking to the land trust community about how can we best approach expanding forest reserves on lands that they might be involved in conserving, for example. We have something called the Resilient Lands Initiative, which is a vision and strategy for land conservation in the state, centered on climate resiliency and mitigation and environmental justice. So part of what we're going to be doing is bringing that to fruition or bringing that to action. So we've been looking at how do we do that, talking to regional and statewide partners, looking at municipal associations and figuring out we have sort of a whole playbook here and what are the tools that we can all use together and best bring to bear to make progress. So on to incentives. The second branch is around supporting forest landowners, forest-based businesses, and rural communities, rural forested communities. And so what I would say is we have a lot of different programs that work toward these goals now. We're looking at expanding those. We want to incentivize climate-oriented forestry, and you're going to hear that word a lot tonight. What we mean by that are forestry and forest practices that are aiming to mitigate climate change through carbon storage and prompt forest adaptation and resilience in a changing climate. So protecting long-term forest health and the ecosystem services, the benefits that forests offer. So we're looking at expanding and new programs that can help with those goals. We're also looking at how do we support passive management that might be solely focused on carbon storage. So we have a team of folks who are working on this branch, a team of talented state staff, and they have been connecting with a lot of different stakeholders. So we were pleased that over 30 stakeholders have given us some of their time. So people who represent private landowners, municipalities, nonprofits, forest-based businesses, having some sort of, focused conversations about, responding to ideas that we have, but also, us asking them, what would be the most helpful to sustain the viability of this suite of the sector. So we're working on that, and we'll have more to say soon about a proposal on how we can move these goals forward. And so lastly, data and transparency. So this is actually,
sorry, can I pause really quick? We're having a few translation issues that I want to just pause and make sure we can address.
Oh, okay. I'll just wait for a moment then.
I believe that the public is hearing Portuguese.
I see. Okay.
When English is selected. All right, some folks seem to think that the problem is solved. We appreciate folks' use of the Q&A to call our attention to the issue. 2 seconds. Okay, I think that everything is all set, folks. If this happens again, I think you may have to toggle between Portuguese and English, but hopefully the issue is resolved. Or use of original audio.
Okay, and you're checking the Q&A?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, so I'm going to proceed, and then I would like you to interrupt me if we're getting signs that this is not working as expected. And so the last branch I want to talk about here is data and transparency. So we do collect a lot of data. For example, we have plots all over the state that collect data from trees on state land, what we call our continuous forest inventory system. But we're looking at investing in and collecting a lot more data, but specific to monitoring climate impacts and sort of climate mitigation that our forests provide. And so part of this is making sure you have the right infrastructure to collect the data and then also analyze it and be able to act on it on an ongoing basis. And probably the most important part is that we want to make data easily available to the public, to anybody who's interested. And so that's what we've been focusing on. We've been talking to other people who have expertise, other states, for example, who have some of this information about forests readily available online. And we are working toward a web-based dashboard that we think will be really helpful and interesting. So let's move on to the next slide. So now we're going to turn to the fourth branch. And so the fourth branch, as part of the fourth branch, which is developing climate-oriented management guidelines for state lands, we've convened a climate forestry committee. And I spoke about them earlier, and thanks, some of them were able to be with us tonight. So these are experts who are giving us some of their time and expertise to develop recommendations around state forest land management and stewardship. So how do we prioritize mitigation and resilience, and how are we making sure that we are really reflecting the latest science? And I should just want to be clear that these guidelines will be applied to our Division of Fisheries and Wildlife lands and both divisions of DCR's state park and water supply lands. And then we intend to also use these guidelines as a platform for some of the incentive programs for private lands or lands that's not owned by the state that I spoke about before. And so we convened this group back in June, and we set forth for this branch of the initiative, we set forth a 6-month time period. And during that time, we elected to pause new timber harvesting contracts on state land. So let's go next to the next slide. So this is just sort of, broadly our perspective. So what are we doing, or what are we focused on? Why are we spending the time on this process? So we're prioritizing resilience and carbon sequestration and storage. We know that science is evolving, conditions are evolving, every day almost, but there's so much new information that we need to consult. And so this is about balancing those climate concerns with other priorities that are core to our missions. Many of those priorities are also impacted by climate change, but it's acknowledging that we have each of the divisions has missions, and we are carrying them out while prioritizing climate change. And I think just acknowledging that we have a forest diverse conditions across the state, and no one expects that a one size fits all approach will work here, but rather a framework, thinking, goals, and criteria that we can then take and apply, and a lens that we can use when we're developing our procedures, our management plans, and the like. So let's move on to the next slide. So our Climate Forestry Committee, we've listed the esteemed body, this group of scientists, practitioners, academics with a range of perspectives and viewpoints, and we have their charge. They're defining goals and objectives for climate-oriented forestry for Massachusetts, looking at best practices and the science, importantly, that supports them, including the practices that we're following today, and then developing a set of recommended management guidelines for the state's consideration. And so, like I said, those would be applied to our state lands. So let's go to the next slide. And so, the guidelines, yes, they're intended to protect forest health, the overall integrity of our ecosystems. And I've already mentioned a couple of times, I think, the importance of our existing carbon stocks, and then the overall sequestration capacity of our forests. And in doing this work, we recognize the distinct missions of our state lands, and our committee has met with the leadership of our 3 divisions to understand that in even more detail. And so what we've done tonight is we've developed some statements that reflect, why don't you go back one, Kurt? Okay, there we go. We've developed some statements that reflect themes and considerations and discussions that the Climate Forestry Committee is having around the guidelines. And we thought this would be a really helpful way, like I said, to give you a readout and a voice into this process. And so part of what we're seeking is, to what degree do you support the different statements? And that's why in the as part of the meeting invitation, and I know we'll put in the chat later, we have a survey that you can fill out where you can indicate your degree of agreement, support or lack of support. And there's also, you can provide other comments as well. So what I'm showing you here are these categories that we're going to be talking about tonight. So this is sort of a table of contents, if you will. These are all, each of these elements has a critical link to climate change. They're also really important forest management issues. So we're really sort of getting at the core here. So with that, I think I will turn it over to Kurt Gärtner, who's going to give you some more detail on each of these categories.
Good evening, everyone. Appreciate all of your participation. My role, as the Undersecretary just said, is to share a bit more on each of these aspects of the work and invite your additional participation through the survey and through other means in engaging in these topics. So to begin with, the first category, the climate-oriented guidelines, the work of the Climate Forestry Committee is Keep Forests as Forests. And the committee, and really, frankly, many of you, validation of the critical importance of keeping forests has been apparent through the work. There is largely broad agreement on this one, and we would expect you to comment on your degree of agreement as part of this process. But also it would be helpful for you to provide input in regard to conservation strategies and priorities. We, the administration, have established a conservation target of 685,000 additional acres of land to help us meet our Forest as Climate Solutions goals and really address climate change and carbon sequestration and storage. The means of doing that, focusing on forest cores has been suggested. Looking at areas with high carbon stocks or potential for carbon storage has been suggested. Looking at areas that conserve habitat in addition to providing for carbon sequestration. Acquiring land with forest reserves in mind, part of the focus. Really invite your comments and opinion on the importance of this one and on the many aspects of conservation. Undersecretary? Did you want to? You look like you wanted to say something.
Oh, no, go ahead. Sorry. No, I'm fine. Go ahead. Thank you. Didn't mean to interrupt.
Next, the second aspect we wanted to feature this evening, aspect of the guidelines, is a habitat for management for habitat, reviewing existing state goals. And of course, our agencies, all three divisions that have forest lands, state parks and recreation, water supply protection, and fisheries and wildlife, do manage in part for habitat. The goals for early successional habitat in particular is something that is being talked about, that we manage for. And the agencies have long acknowledged that management for habitat purposes has carbon implications. The Climate Forestry Committee is talking about the carbon impacts of creating habitat, particularly early successional, and suggesting that the state look at its intentions regarding habitat and particularly examining the least carbon impactful ways in which habitat goals can be met. Also would note that there are a number of habitat goals and perhaps some of the targets around carbon sequestration, the ways in which we might provide it might also coincide with achieving habitat goals. And that can be discussed perhaps as part of our the administration's announced biodiversity initiative or executive order. The third category on this slide that we wanted to talk about a bit is disturbances. We're inviting input on this statement relative to disturbances. We are seeing more frequent and intense storms in Massachusetts as climate is changing. How to handle those in the context of land management and forestry and forest management is important to us. And we would value your input on this particular statement relative to forests and disturbance. Essentially, how would you propose that we manage forests when a disturbance has occurred in the context of our climate mitigation and resilience objectives? Next, carbon sequestration and storage. We're looking for your level of agreement with the importance of protecting carbon stocks found in the oldest trees and forests, that forest reserves with minimal or no tree harvesting are important for maintaining carbon stocks, that young and middle-aged forests are particularly important for higher sequestration rates, but that managing for that age range for carbon sequestration difficult, impractical. And this is the key phrase here. Instead, managing for a diverse range of ages and developmental stages across forest landscapes is the optimal means of promoting carbon sequestration and many other ecosystem services. Essentially, we invite your thoughts on that statement that's part of the guidelines discussion and part of the work of the Climate Forestry Committee. As to soils, another aspect of the work and the report, they are the largest carbon pool in Massachusetts forest ecosystems, generally storing more carbon than is found in live biomass. And the statement here has to do with harvesting practices and reducing soil disturbance as a means of preserving soil integrity, the carbon that is stored in the soils, and the diversity of organisms present. We invite your thoughts on this statement and harvesting practices in regard to carbon stored in soils and the other functions of soils. The next category, we presented this one in a bit of a different way. There are a couple of different schools of thought among Climate Forestry Committee members as to resilience. It's probably important to mention that resilience is one of the rationales that the agencies cite when pursuing land management, when performing forest management projects. And we invite your thoughts on these two statements. First of all, one perspective that Massachusetts forests, they're inherently resilient and they do not require human intervention, that ecological processes, including disturbance, forest regeneration, should be allowed to unfold without a lot or any human intervention. Alternatively, we invite your thoughts on the second statement. Climate change is creating new conditions that highly stress and threaten Massachusetts forests, that active management can create forest conditions, including a diversity of climate-adapted species, varied age classes, that will increase adaptive capacity and promote resilience to ecological disturbances. And therefore, these should occur as part of a management strategy. Next, in regard to invasives and disease, no question that insects and disease can cause tree mortality that can result in emissions to the environment of carbon to the environment. And here's the question for you, and you invite your input. Active management strategies, including tree harvesting, should be employed if a novel infestation may be eradicated through rapid response. Proactive harvesting should only occur in limited circumstances where there's a clear rationale. Another aspect of what the committee is talking about has to do with invasive plants, and we invite your survey response and others on invasive plants can cause significant tree mortality and negatively impact forest regeneration, such as climbing vines, and they should be removed when feasible. Essentially, when should, sorry folks, slides tend to move a little faster than I anticipate. And then finally, wood production. The active management of public lands presently produces only a small volume of wood. This is because wood production is incidental to management of public lands for other objectives, such as habitat, water supply protection, and recreation. Total wood production in Massachusetts on public and private lands is about 5 to 7% of the wood that we consume in the Commonwealth. And more wood, especially long-lived products, should be sourced from Massachusetts forests with some contributions from state lands. That is something that we invite your thought on that perspective on that statement and how that should be addressed in the work of the Climate Forestry Committee and the subsequent management guidelines. So hopefully that gave you some insight into the work of the committee, the questions we're working to address, and the content of future guidelines. And with that, let me turn it over to Caroline Higley, who's going to walk us through the input session and logistics.
Hi all. As a heads up, our intent was to post the statements into the chat, but I'm struggling with volume issues accordingly, so I'll make sure I can either share the written comment link online or could get those into the chat otherwise for your review. We wanted to talk about a few logistics before we head over into the public input session portion of this meeting. As a reminder, we are using the Zoom webinar platform, which has certain limitations. When we give you speaking permission, Zoom unfortunately does not allow for video. We request, as folks have been doing so far, that you use the Q&A function for any logistical or clarifying questions, and we will do our best to address these types of questions as we go. The world of oral comments, if an attendee wishes to speak, we request that you sign up via the form that was distributed via the event notice email, the webpage, Zoom registration, and that I will also post in the chat momentarily as well. Attendees will be called on in the sign-up order of the oral comment form. And when it is time for the oral commenter to speak, we're going to read aloud your name. We're going to enable you to unmute, at which point you may begin speaking. Speaking time is limited to 3 minutes, and that will be available or visible via the on-screen timer that we have. One quick note here too, if you do wish to provide oral comments, it is necessary that you registered individually for the Zoom session so that we can identify you. And it is necessary that your oral comment sign up uses the exact same name so we can identify you when we search you. Another few logistical pieces, written comments can be shared via the survey form on our Forces Climate Solutions webpage, linked here. Can be found via Google as well. Submission of written comments related to this session by Tuesday, November 21st at 5 p.m. will facilitate consideration. And then finally, we do have an email list on the Forces Climate Solutions webpage, and we request any additional comments or questions not related to this listening session, or if you wish to submit any attachments to the guidelines at mass.gov email. I believe that those are all the logistical components at this point in time, and I can hand things over to Susan Fadziba to begin calling on folks.
Thank you. Just before I do that, I think that there was a request to say a little bit about how the comments will be used, and I think Undersecretary Stephanie Cooper is going to respond to that.
Thank you. Yes, Caroline did a nice job of previewing some of sort of the wrap up, but we do want you to know that we intend to publish the comments as we did for the first meeting, and we will give them great consideration, and they will be particularly helpful to the state when we are considering the recommendations of the Climate Forestry Committee. So we look forward to that.
Okay. Thank you. With that, we'll start with the list of commenters. The first person is Chris Egan.
Thank you. Chris Egan, I'm the Executive Director of the Massachusetts Forest Alliance. We represent forest landowners, foresters, timber harvesters, and forest products companies. So we're hoping to see the actual draft guidelines or draft report of the committee. It's unfortunate that that didn't happen in time for this meeting, but we remain concerned about the goal of ending the pause on schedule next month, and we hope the project remains on track and important forest management work can resume on state lands. As Kurt mentioned, there may be some disagreement within the Climate Forestry Committee on forest resilience and the role of forest management in creating it. We believe it's well established that having diverse species mix, diverse age classes, and diverse vertical structure leads to added forest resilience to severe weather, invasive pests, and other forest health challenges. There's also compelling research that indicates that these diverse forests are better able to sequester carbon. Forest management can help create this diverse structure and offer these benefits, but in any case, having a mix of reserves and actively managed forests addresses both resilience statements. We believe that forest management projects on state lands can serve as important demonstrations of silvicultural science because state agencies have funding to engage in work that private landowners often do not. While private landowners would like to increase species and age class diversity by removing poor quality, less vigorous trees, they often cannot afford to do so, as that type of forest management work does not result in a financial return to landowners and in fact costs them money. State projects that accomplish this goal can serve as important demonstration and research sites. And the research being captured on the ground through processes like DCR's continuous forest inventory, referred to earlier, is really important, and we encourage DCR and EEA to communicate findings from decades of careful measurement out to the public, as that will help inform public debate on forest carbon. It was encouraging to see the DCR propose collaborating with universities on research on some of their delayed 2022 forest management projects, and we hope that continues as work resumes. We believe, as do most of the leading environmental organizations and land trusts in Massachusetts who are on record saying so repeatedly, that a mix of forest reserves and actively managed lands is important and appropriate on both public and private lands. Meeting our demand for wood products and encouraging the use of low embodied carbon wood in construction should be part of a balanced approach to public land management. We have additional thoughts on the statements issued tonight, and we'll include those in written comments that we'll submit later. Thanks for the opportunity to share our perspective.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Sarah Freeman.
I believe that Sarah indicated they'd leave early.
Okay, thank you. Then we'll go to Dick and Crane.
Hi. I assume you can hear me.
Yes, we can.
Okay. I may be jumping on someone else's comment, but I want to say, in case they don't, Russ Richardson pointed out that a better word to use for forest, quote, conservation or preservation would be the word perpetuation. And that what we're really, however you interpret those other words, perpetuation is really our goal. I think it's a word that we should include in how we talk about forests. But on forest reserves and how passive management is sort of the goal, no human intervention in forest reserves, I think has many merits, but I'm not sure that you can always say that better carbon storage is one of those merits. There are places where that is true, but there are places where that is not true. And I think it has to be made very clear that just because something is in a reserve and is passively managed does not mean it will always have better carbon storage. Because we can look at a lot of really, you look at Yosemite, it is burned up. That referring to the greatest, that our oldest trees have the largest carbon storage, or our carbon stocks are greatest in our oldest trees. I'm sure that is true, but they are also vulnerable, just like all of us older people. They're not going to live forever. So I don't think we want to necessarily consider our oldest trees as our salvation when it comes to carbon storage. And another thing I think is really important to consider are the fossil fuel offsets that our forests can provide in various ways that we manage them, from salvaging dead trees to utilizing trees that are cut, or parts of even living trees, just parts of trees that are cut to protect our electric infrastructure. That is wood that is going to end up in the atmosphere anyway. And if we can keep some fossil fuel in the ground while we are utilizing material we are cutting anyway, I think that is left out of the discussion. And I think it's a very important thing to be included in the discussion.
All right, thank you. Thank you. We've gone past your 3 minutes. So
okay, thank you very much.
We're going to move to the next one, but thank you very much for your comments. Before I go on, I just want to remind people that it's a 3-minute limit on comments, and you can see the clock in my little box on Zoom. And when you hear that sound, that means you've made it to your 3 minutes. With that, I'm going to move to Kate O'Connor.
Are you able to hear me?
Yes, we are. Thank you.
Great, thank you for having this hearing. And I'm in favor of permanent protection without management for as much of Massachusetts forests as we can save. That the ability of non-managed forests to sequester more carbon has been established by science. And there's a lot of greenwashing saying that younger trees can sequester more carbon, and that's just greenwashing. They simply don't. and pro-forestation, leaving the trees standing, is really essential, not only for carbon sequestration, but also for the water management and storage and movement services that trees provide, which is compromised when you forest. The other things that forests provide in terms of habitat are best provided by older forests. And the idea that we need to manage habitat for species that require different ages, there will be plenty of forestry continuing on private lands to provide that additional habitat. I believe that all of our state lands that the Commonwealth currently owns should be converted to permanent forest reserves without management, and allow the industrial forestry industry to do their production on private lands.
Thank you.
I'm just looking quickly. A couple of other.
Sorry, I thought that she was finished. She may
Oh no.
she may have about a minute more, so I don't know if, sorry about that, Kate.
Apologies, Kate.
I took your pause as a conclusion.
Okay, I'm sorry. I was just looking at your list of issues. In terms of wood production, if we are able to conserve 40 to 50% of Massachusetts forests as permanent reserves without management, that leaves the other 40 to 60% or 50% available for forestry products, and they can be managed in the best way possible for those forestry projects. But I don't believe that that should be a priority. In terms of invasive species and diseases, allowing trees to self-manage. We've created a lot of problems by trying to manage forests for all kinds of things. And I think forests probably are a lot wiser than us humans. So that's where I'll leave it. Thank you.
Thank you. Next person is Carl DeZora. I hope I didn't mispronounce that name too badly.
Jura, just like it was Jura. Thank you.
Thank you.
First, regarding the 10 statements sent with rating scales last Friday, they are not a sufficient substitute for genuine discussion about the management of our forests, since they lack the nuance needed to make decisions. These are my general comments. After the state has spent millions of taxpayer dollars over decades to convince citizens that state-owned forests need to be logged, while ignoring citizens who request information about that logging, Mass EEA now states that, quote, there are different schools of thought among Climate Forestry Committee members regarding resilience, close quote, in a form it emailed. These unnamed scientists believe that, quote, Massachusetts forests are inherently resilient and do not require human intervention. Ecological processes, including disturbances in forest regeneration, should be allowed to unfold without intervention, close quote. This statement is consistent with the call in Wildlands in New England to set aside 10% of forests as unlogged wildlands, about the amount of state-owned forest land in Massachusetts. Unfortunately, the state is conveying this information very late in the process. It has only been published ephemerally in a form that disappears upon submission. The late and obscure release of this information in comparison to the state's lengthy, expensive campaign to justify logging does not do justice to this information. The state must correct the imbalance. Please uphold the EEA's published commitment to, quote, develop forest management guidelines based on the latest climate science, close quote, by 1, completing the promised discussion of expanding reserves and including a genuine public discussion in conjunction with the release of that committee's proceedings before issuing forest guidelines. 2, publish the proceedings of the Climate Forestry Committee widely on the FACS website and elsewhere. 3, solicit and fulfill requests for information about logging and burning in our state-owned forests. 4, provide a definition of climate-smart forestry including support for burning lands for habitat management with a bibliography of publicly accessible studies that support implementation in the Northeast. 5, extend the logging moratorium and facilitate a genuinely robust public discussion that includes the possibility of declaring our state-owned forests as wildlands as defined in Wildlands in New England, the 23 study endorsed by dozens of scientists. Without these steps, the state is undemocratically and unscientifically declaring that we must continue logging and burning our state-owned forests, thereby discounting the views of thousands of citizens who petitioned the state to end these practices. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next commenter is Mariana Mased.
I'm sorry, I did not have any comment at this time. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. We'll go to Bruce Spencer.
So I noticed that Bruce had something in the Q&A that he may be under another name. I can find that and perhaps we can come back to him, because if you're looking to elevate him under that name, you may not find him. So I can find that message.
Yeah, I believe that both the oral comment sign up and name in the Zoom session are under this name, and that the alternate name is not in either list.
And in fact, he appears to be here, so perhaps everything I'm saying is not correct or outdated. So I'll stop.
I guess with that, Bruce, you have the ability to unmute yourself at this point in time.
Okay, can you hear me now?
There we go.
Thank you. I really support active tending on most public lands. I really don't think we have a choice. Our own inventory shows that mortality is increasing and growth is decreasing. And I suspect in not too long, mortality will exceed growth. And then where are we? I think we need to manage not only for wood products and habitat, safety, aesthetics, parks, carbon sequestration, promote regeneration, salvage, all those sorts of things and more. I've traveled extensively, and in Europe, where they have disasters happening to the forest, they restore the forest. They plant, they utilize, they concern with the aesthetics, and they have incredible workmanship. Well, what I've seen in the United States, we tend to either just do nothing, as we're proposing, or they just cut and leave everything. And it's really strange to walk into a forest to see lots of trees laying on the ground. It does affect the aesthetics. So, as I said in the beginning, I don't think we have a choice. The limitations of the soils, as I've spoke about in other places, we need to pay attention to them to make sure we don't throw the bathwater out with the baby by carefully protecting our soils while we do this tending. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next commenter is Don Ogden.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Thank you. With all due respect to Bruce Spencer, who I know is one of the best foresters around, I fear that the Baker administration holdovers have had their way with forests as climate solutions initiative. There's a lot of business as usual in there when it comes to our public lands. Reference to early successional habitat here tonight being an example. I see rogue agencies like DCR and mass wildlife stripping our public lands, which are critical for natural carbon capture in a time of climate crisis. That must end if we are being honest about addressing the climate emergency. Just today, I read from a prestigious scientific study that forests can absolutely help us with around a third of our climate goals under the 2015 Paris Climate Agreement. I suggest our climate chief, the governor and her staff, and members of the newly formed Climate Forestry Committee take a serious tour of the clear cuts those agencies have initiated across the Commonwealth over the years and that they walked those barren public lands to experience all the devastation that took place and is taking place today. These are climate crimes, full stop. We can and must end logging on our public lands if we are truly going to address the existential crisis we and future generations face. Thank you for the opportunity for letting me speak.
Thank you. Our next commenter is Zach Porter.
Good evening. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Great. Thank you. My name is Zach Porter. I'm the executive director of Standing Trees. Standing Trees is a New England-wide organization working to protect and restore forests on public lands. I am based in Montpelier, Vermont, but I have members across the 6-state region, and I'm a Massachusetts native. I appreciate the chance to visit with you all tonight. We submitted detailed written comments that I hope you all have seen during the first phase of commenting, and we will absolutely provide you with written comments on the questions that you've put out there this evening. I think instead of addressing those directly, what I want to comment on this evening is that having observed public land management closely for a couple of decades now, I get nervous when I hear the word guidelines. And I know that that is a headlining word here for this process, but I want to encourage the people running this process, as well as decision makers at higher levels, to think critically about whether what we need right now are guidelines or to be working towards something more substantial like rules. In my experience, rulemaking is essential, especially as far as public lands are concerned. Rules make public lands public. They hold state agencies accountable to the public. And as wise as we may be, and everyone in this room may be, we can't know for sure who will come next, who will be managing the state's lands in the future. And rules are essential for ensuring that there is transparency and accountability, that there's recourse for the public. Guidelines will only get us so far. And I think I fear will leave us wanting a lot more at the end of this detailed process that you are leading. And I hope that you will think about ways to, again, just make sure that we're leaving this great discussion with more concrete outcomes and ways for the public to have a set of expectations that it can kind of see the state live up to when it's making decisions about management plans and then project level decisions on state lands. So this guidelines process is important, but again, I hope that you will consider something even more in-depth and rigorous, perhaps next, if not as a part of this guidelines process. So thanks for the chance to comment, and we will submit more written comments soon.
You're welcome, and thank you. The next person on my list is Anne without a second name. I don't know if there's a way to identify that person. Perhaps if there is an Anne who registered to comment, she can put her name in the chat.
So there are no participants right now with the first name of Anne. So perhaps this individual, based on the email used to sign up, can come back and resubmit a request for an oral comment, or just confirm that both names are the same otherwise.
Okay, thanks. Let's go to Michael Morey.
Good evening. I'd like to thank EEA and the members of the Special Climate Forest Committee for all the work they've been doing on this. My first point is that I would like to request that the public have a chance to see and comment on the proposed guidelines before they become finalized. My second point is this. I'd like to state clearly, as many others have, that we need both wild and managed forests for the different things they do. Some of the wild forest will certainly be in large designated blocks, but as a practicing forester, I'd like to be sure that people realize there's room for wildness within the framework of a managed forest as well. And this is true at a number of scales, from the small stand scale to the property scale to the local landscape scale. When we use terms such as wild forest or managed forest, we need to understand them properly. Otherwise, we cannot communicate clearly. Let's take the term managed forest. Many people may not realize that it is rare in our area that a managed forest is entirely managed. By the same token, let's take the term wild forest. To what extent can a forest be truly wild at this juncture in our history, even if it is given a wild forest designation? Both managed and wild forests are a question of degree. There's no 100% purity. The real question, though, regardless of whether the forest is classified as wild or managed, is this: will the forest be able to adapt to climate change? The main mechanism of adaptation for a forest is the same mechanism as perpetuation of a forest, referring to an earlier speaker. And this is the following: to be able to grow new trees, not just a sufficient quantity of trees, but also a sufficient diversity of tree species. And this is true of both wild and managed forests. It may turn out that we need to adjust how we manage our managed forests to better ensure that this is happening. And ironically, perhaps, we may need to step in and support wild forests as well, support them with judicious management. Otherwise, more and more of the designated wild forest being subject to a whole host of ongoing negative and interfering factors to which they're not immune, risks becoming a degraded forest over time instead of the wonderful wild forest we had hoped for. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next commenter is Stephen Sears.
Hello, thank you all for having us be able to comment and for your consideration. I'd like to thank all the speakers, regardless of their position. I think everyone probably has 98% agreement on protecting the forests. In regards to keeping forests as forests, one of the things I'd like you to consider is to have the reuse of existing buildings have some type of incentive which will prevent people from cutting down forests to put in places like the school we heard of in the last forum. I think whether it's a tax credit or something along those lines could help with that. In regards to forest management for habitat, I think the biodiversity goals that are going to be established are really essential, and I very strongly support management on fish and wildlife lands and other lands where applicable to increase the biodiversity across the state. One of the things, I'm not sure where it fits in your order of questions that you've presented, but I also want to assure the presumption of openness on any lands that the state owns where it's applicable. I know in watersheds, certain water areas, that's not possible, but I think the presumption of openness is necessary if we are going to support and give incentive to private landowners. There has to be some allowance for passive recreation on those properties as well. And in regards to soils, I don't know if you're going to be addressing open mining, but maybe limiting the size of gravel operations and such, and making sure that you minimize the open areas and actually recover them with appropriate soils and trees as fast as possible, I think will help with that. And thank you for allowing me to speak.
Thank you. Our next commenter is Laura Marks.
I actually didn't sign up to speak, but thanks, Susan.
Okay, sorry. Thanks for coming. Laura's a member of the committee. Mary Wigmore is our next commenter.
Good evening. Thank you all for your work on this project. I just have to trust in the wisdom of this process to find a compromise that keeps us all working for the good of our forest. I support the statement about ecological forestry, or as you're terming it, climate-oriented forestry. I believe it is capable of the development of carbon-rich forest with high resiliency to the predicted impacts of our warming climate. I have practiced ecological forestry in Western Mass for 45 years. I've used silviculture that produced forests that would meet your committee's definition of a carbon-rich and climate-adaptive and resilient forest ecosystem for decades. Public and private foresters who practice good ecological forestry will continue to deliver to society sustainable ecological function from portions of both public and private forests that have been designated as working forest. These would include carbon sequestration, clean water, and local lumber products. I ask that you give us, the practicing foresters in the Commonwealth, a chance to use science-based, climate-oriented silviculture integrated with our environmental ethical code, and continue to care for the portions of our forest that you allow us to work in. Please understand that we who spend our lives working in the forest, we love her just as much as those who might be opposed to any disturbance through timber harvesting to the forest. And we don't wish her harm, and we will not do anything to shortchange our children's ability to enjoy the same precious treasures that we all take for granted out of the forest. I would ask in closing that you just give us all a chance to work and use our special skill set for active forest management on the portions of the forest that we all can agree are suitable and appropriate for silviculture, much as people who are opposed to active forest management on the public and private lands of Massachusetts wish for us to share a part of their value system and allow them to care and store portions of the forest that they treasure in a manner that then find is best for them. So I really want to thank you for letting me give comment.
Thank you. Our next commenter is Kate Conlon.
Why is it that we seem to seek the purity of our own absence on the land? That we've established a hierarchy of interaction with natural spaces that generally deems recreation good or neutral and work or management bad, indicative of human conquest or ego? The questions about our forests that we're being asked to consider all reside within this faulty framework and within problematic cultural distinctions between what's wild and what's not. It's troubling to hear individuals canvass against actively preserving biodiversity while simultaneously speculating that ecosystem health will be our salvation, which demonstrates not only a lack of trust in our public agencies, but a lack of acknowledgement of the trade-offs we must make on any given piece of land in service to many goals: carbon, habitat, renewable resources, forest health, equity, which we should not see as in competition, but as reliant on one another and us reliant on them. The balance between these factors best decided in real time by conditions on the ground, not prescriptive policy. Thanks for your time.
Thank you. Our next commenter is Heidi Rishi.
Thank you. First, I just want to say that I am speaking tonight as a private citizen, private individual, resident of the town of Shirley, Massachusetts. I greatly appreciate all the work that EEA and the other state agencies are doing on this, and the committee volunteering their time to provide their expertise to the state. I also appreciate the complexity involved and the commitment of the state to address multiple important, critically important goals here, to conserve more land, to work with private landowners, land trusts, and municipalities, as well as the state agencies, to address climate, biodiversity, water resources, recreation, habitat, so many different interests. It's not easy, and I really do appreciate this effort. I wanted to just point out a few things that have come to my attention in regards to some of the public lands that I'd like you to consider. And I support both active management for forestry, for timber production, and for climate resilience, and for habitat. And also I support having designated reserves. I'd like you to consider the efforts that so many people have undertaken over many decades here in my area, dating back to Benton MacKay, the founder of the Appalachian Trail system. There are lands here that have been protected going back many, many decades under his vision, and that were envisioned as wilderness back then, and that remain in the condition, except for growth, since they were protected back in the 1960s. Since then, the municipalities surrounding those state lands and land trusts and many, many individuals have contributed to protection of many additional parcels, all creating an interconnected network of protected lands, but under many different ownerships. And many of us had all thought that these lands would remain that way until state agency decided that it was important to do some habitat management. And open habitat has been mentioned, but not pine barrens or oak woodlands. I think that needs to be addressed. I'm not saying I'm opposed or supportive of any of this, but I think that the thing that was mentioned earlier about transparency is exceedingly important. And when you have a biomap core forest area that's diverse and free of invasives currently, that needs to be considered in all this. And can we do the management we need on lands that are already more open and disturbed and that have invasives on them? So just some things to consider, not an opinion one way or another. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Jonathan Parrott.
I don't see Jonathan on here.
Okay, thank you. Let's go to Bill Kiley.
Don't see Bill Kiley.
Okay, how about John Przezinski?
Yes, I'm here.
Great.
My name is John Przezinski. I'm a project assistant for the Berkshire Environmental Action Team. I'm going to address a specific aspect of forest management. I live next to Beartown State Forest in Monterey in Berkshires. I'm a trail runner, and I've run every trail in the forest, including those on which motorized off-road vehicles, ORVs, are permitted. It's difficult for me to understand the rationale behind allowing motorized ORVs in a state forest. The noise and exhaust from ORVs destroys the wilderness experience. People go to the forest to enjoy the beauty and the peace, not the roar of internal combustion engines. On a busy weekend, it's hard to escape the sound and the smell, which can travel for miles through the forest. Several years ago, I started a change.org petition to disallow ORVs in Massachusetts state forests, which garnered about 540 signatures and a few death threats. Several respondents noted that they don't walk in the forest on summer weekends because of the noise of ORVs. Off-road vehicles increase soil erosion, pollute streams with gas and oil, turn meadows and streams into mud bogs, spread invasive species, and disrupt wildlife. ORV trails that were originally 10 to 12 feet wide become 20 to 30 feet wide in low-lying areas because the center of the trail has been turned into a deep, muddy, gasoline-streaked puddle as ORVs circle around to avoid the mosquito breeding lake they've caused in the center. The sides of the trails are eroded, often to a depth of 2 feet or more, making canyons that are difficult for a pedestrian to clamber out of when a pack of dirt bikes roars around the corner, particularly in steep areas where ORV-caused erosion has turned trails into slippery fields of rocks and boulders. In this era of impending climate disaster, we need to be doing everything we can to reduce the burning of fossil fuels. Can we at least discourage the burning of fossil fuels for purely recreational purposes in our state forests? Thank you for your time and the work you're doing.
Thank you. Our next commenter is Sarah Singh.
Don't see Sarah in attendance.
Okay, Russell Richardson.
I do not see Russell in attendance.
Jared Friedman.
Good evening. My name is Jared Friedman. I'm the Chief of Staff for Senator Jo Comerford, who represents the Hampshire Franklin Worcester District in the State Senate. She's in session right now, so I'm testifying on her behalf. The Hampshire Franklin Worcester District has hundreds of thousands of acres of forested land, and the residents of our district, as well as Senator Comerford and myself, are urgently concerned about climate change. We understand the critical role that our natural and working lands play in sequestering CO2 and in mitigating the worst impacts of climate change. And we also understand the full spectrum of financial impacts associated with stewarding such an important resource for the Commonwealth and for our planet, including foregone economic development opportunities and reduced municipal tax revenues. I really appreciated the questions that Kurt laid out that you are soliciting input on, and we'll respond to those questions. This comment is just focused on kind of an overarching strategy for managing our natural and working lands to meet our climate goals. As you all know, our modeling and plans for reducing our emissions as required by law rely on increased carbon sequestration from natural and working lands. And so we applaud the Forests as Climate Solutions Initiative for setting a no net loss goal for the Commonwealth, ensuring state forests are managed based on the latest climate science, and providing incentives for private landowners to help them keep their forests as forests. For these same reasons, Senator Comerford filed legislation called an Act Investing in Natural and Working Lands. The legislation would enshrine in statute that our natural and working lands are inherently valuable and give our Commonwealth and its agencies the mission of preventing the loss of farmland and forest land. This legislation also recognizes that some municipalities are doing more than their fair share, or as Senator Comerford would say, breathing for the Commonwealth. And we believe the state should help municipalities that want to do the right thing, like providing technical assistance for developing a natural resource protection zoning ordinance, incentives for developing municipal tree retention or tree canopy bylaws, enhanced pilot payments. We also understand that MEPA plays a key role in protecting our forested land. The Clean Energy and Climate Plan directed MEPA to add a review threshold that would require projects engaging in a certain level of forest clearing to undergo an environmental review process. And we agree, and we believe that review threshold should be driven by and aligned with our carbon sequestration goals. Finally, we support requiring recurring reviews of the incentives for land conservation and stewardship program, including the SOL pilot program, to ensure these programs continue to present incentives for land conservation and do not themselves become a barrier to further conservation due to insufficient reimbursement rates. Senator Comerford very much looks forward to working with the administration on any aspects of the Forests as Climate Solutions Initiative that require legislation. And thank you all.
Thank you. Our next commenter is Charles Thompson.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Thank you. My name is Charles Thompson. I live in Hampshire County. I'm a retired forester with forest management experience in most of the major forest regions of the U.S. and as well as Central America. Everybody on the so-called Climate Forestry Committee is very familiar with the adaptation workbook from the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science, and I suspect that most of the people on this Zoom are as well. there are a number of silvicultural techniques available for the forest types that are found in Massachusetts. And a suggestion I'd like to make is that DCR forests, that a number of experiments be set up using the full range of practices and measures suggested in the adaptation workbook, as well as standard silvicultural knowledge on DCR forests, and that we also provide the resources to measure, analyze, and evaluate what happens over time on these applied research experiments. It's a long-term undertaking, but it would ultimately provide useful information about what does and does not succeed as smart forest management in a changing climate. I fear, I don't know this, but I fear that the recommendations of the Climate Forestry Committee might constrain or restrict the diversity of approaches that are recommended. And my feeling is that if we want to know how to adapt, we need to try more, not fewer things, and look and invest in really understanding what's going on with these experimental areas. And finally, I don't need to come up with this. I'm just going to quote the IPCC, and because nobody can say it better, which is that in the long term, a sustainable forest management strategy aimed at maintaining or increasing forest carbon stocks while producing an annual sustained yield of timber, fiber, or energy from the forest will generate the largest sustained mitigation benefit. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next commenter is Aaron Townsley.
Hello, and thank you for this opportunity to provide public testimony. I am a resident of Hopkinton, Massachusetts, and I am a chapter board member of the New England chapter of Backcountry Hunters and Anglers. A core tenet of Backcountry Hunters and Anglers is the protection of our public lands and waters using science-based management policies so that current and future generations can connect with these places, be it for recreation, sustenance, or a deeper personal connection to the wilderness. While carbon sequestration is absolutely critical, building resilient landscapes capable of withstanding the increasing impacts of a changing climate is ultimately paramount. A single drought, fire, storm, or pest outbreak can rapidly undo long-term carbon sequestration efforts. Therefore, prioritizing both forest resilience and the protection of a diverse range of critical habitats is crucial for protection of the Commonwealth against the worst effects of climate change. Optimization of carbon sequestration should not drive forest management at the expense of other critical ecosystem services. It must be integrated into a broader set of objectives. Agencies like Mass Wildlife and DCR have already achieved victories in this regard, and we must ensure our state biologists have a permanent seat at this committee's table. They are the public's agency, tasked with the protection of all of our state species from common game to our most endangered, and their experience should help shape future policy. Given the vast majority of forests in the state are privately owned, we must prioritize the creation of policies that incentivize private landowners to maintain healthy forests, as it is private lands that are under the greatest threat of deforestation by commercial or residential development and poor forestry management. However, our limited public lands must prioritize objectives that are less achievable on private lands. These public land objectives should include protecting rare habitats and species, promoting resilient landscapes, and safeguarding clean water resources. By some estimates, the totality of the forest within the Commonwealth could address 14% of our carbon sequestration needs, but our public lands are just a fraction of that 14%. While our opinions of how we get to a sustainable future may differ, it is great to see so many groups that are so passionate about protecting forests. The members of Backcountry Hunters and Anglers look forward to working with all stakeholders in these efforts. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Our next commenter is Lenore Brick. Not here. Okay, Dale Labonte.
Hello, I'm Dale Labonte. I appreciate the work that this group is presenting and the comments that I'm hearing in this presentation. I'd like to second the idea of transparency in the processes of the department, and also study of what's actually happening in the various areas where active management is occurring. The idea of conserving and managing is a throwback to the colonial idea that nature is there for human use, and that we understand best how to take care of that or exploit that resource. I would prefer the language to say preserve and pro-forest, so that in the short term, we stop doing any intervention on state-owned land so as to sequester as much carbon as possible, because we need that resource right now. We need those trees to be doing what they're doing without interference and without taking them out of the picture. I would urge that the state consider continuing the moratorium for 6 more months or possibly another year while these different issues that are being brought forward can be considered and taken up productively. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Matthew DeBona.
Good evening. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Great, thank you. My name is Matt DeBona. I'm a biologist with a conservation organization called the National Wild Turkey Federation. We have over 1,000 members in Massachusetts. And I just wanted to say, to the undersecretary and the panel, I appreciate the efforts that you guys are involved with. It sounds like there's a lot of exciting things on the horizon under this initiative. A special thanks to the Climate Forestry Committee. This is it's not surprising, I guess, looking at the survey questions, that there's a diversity of opinions around resiliency. I would say that my organization is more aligned with the idea that we're going to have to build resiliency in our forest through active management. These are second growth forests. They're highly impacted by prior land use. We know that disturbances are going to get more frequent and more severe. And I think we need to give our forests a little bit of an edge and kind of get them along the way. I will, acknowledge that, in terms of inherent resiliency, perhaps forest reserves, will help address that. But it's important that the establishment of forest reserves is not driven by carbon storage. Forest reserves should be a tool to protect important species, important plant communities, ecosystem processes, and then the carbon storage benefits will come along as an ancillary benefit. I think we can still get there. With respect to some of the other topics, and I will provide more specific written comments, making wildlife habitat is messy. And, I appreciate the idea of looking at our habitat management goals and practices and identifying carbon sensitive techniques where possible. I don't think that we should let that get in the way of how we manage for wildlife. I think we need solutions that go across public and private lands. I think that, it's obvious that we're not doing enough on private lands because our biodiversity crisis is statewide, it's region wide. It has nothing to do whether it's on public land or private land. And we need to make sure that we're protecting those species going forward. I think retaining flexibility should be the mantra when developing these guidelines, because quite frankly, I think we've reached the edge of the map. We don't know what the future is going to bring. Today's carbon sinks could be tomorrow's carbon sources. We just don't know. And so or carbon emitters, I guess, but just making sure that that we're keeping options open as we move forward. Definitely, as others have echoed, would appreciate the opportunity to provide comments on draft guidelines before everything is finalized. I don't know if that's an option or not, but it would be appreciated. Thank you very much.
Thank you. The next person I've listed as Pat S.
Yeah, Susan, we don't have any Pat S's. We had chatted about that. I also just wanted to pause and note that I'll do a refresh of the oral comment list in the chat right now as well.
Okay. Thank you. Let's go to Janet Sinclair. Janet, can you unmute yourself? Thank you.
I'm trying, I couldn't find it. Sorry. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. I am very interested in all of this, but I have to say, I thought what we were going to be commenting on a draft proposal, and I feel like, you're listening to all of us talk about all the things that we would always say, that we think about everything, like every person here, that we all know each other, many of us, and we kind of know what each other thinks, but unless we have a draft to comment on, I feel like that this is very frustrating, and perhaps other people don't feel so, but other people have mentioned it. It makes sense to me, some of the comments of that included, for example, Charlie Thompson, to actually have applied research, to actually be looking at what's going on when we choose certain, management styles on any forest. It's shocking to me in a way that we would, be at the stage right now of saying that we need to pay attention to the outcomes of these various management practices. But the reality is that that's true. We don't really know the outcomes. So if we don't know outcomes, how could we possibly make, much of a plan? And so I would say that we, first of all, need a much longer moratorium. I feel like if the public doesn't get to comment on the draft, I'm going to say out loud everywhere I can that this is like a really pathetic process if we are not able to comment. I mean, this is kind of crazy to me. I would also say that that we don't need to do large experiments on our state land. We have these very large areas, like with pine barren restoration projects, that nobody knows the outcome is. I don't think anybody did an inventory of what was there before. I don't know what inventories are happening after. As I listen to DCR talk about stuff, sometimes I'm just so surprised at how little knowledge goes into any of these management ideas. I think that we just have to really understand how little that we know. And we don't need to do, hundreds or thousands of acres of clear cuts in a pine barren somewhere to see what's going to happen. In the Montague Plains, there's a cocoon showed up, honestly, on 1,500 acres of clear cut. And I would also say that those of us who oppose forest management on state land, a lot of my feeling, and I think other people's feeling, is that we're looking at this as a over the whole landscape of the state, or over the whole landscape of New England. We have almost no land set aside, like a national park, and people are not calling for logging on national parks. We don't have land set aside. And so this is what we are all talking about. None of us are talking about don't ever log. We're talking about we need reserves, and we need more of them, and that they should be on our state land. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next commenter is Win Trainer Gvenvold.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
I'm reading a statement on behalf of the Nashua River Watershed Association. As we face a global climate crisis, the NRWA advocates for a transparent, community-driven, science-based forest management approach that accounts for the role that our forests play in sustaining a healthy climate. The NRWA is concerned that current management policies and procedures lack transparency and public engagement, with inconsistent consideration of the carbon impacts of proposed projects. As an example, 3 communities in the Nashua River watershed are currently being affected by a significant restoration plan proposed by Mass Wildlife for the Squanicook River Wildlife Management Area, a site that spans 2,000 acres of forests along the Squanicook River. Today, that area is recognized at both the federal and state level for its ecological and recreational value. This wildlife management area is located within an area of critical environmental concern. It's received state-level distinction for being a site containing natural heritage and endangered species program priority habitat, a cold water fisheries resource, a biomap forest core, a reference river which overlies high water quality aquifers, and a maturing forest which contributes to fight against climate change. Most notably, the Squanicook River itself, which flows through the area, is a federally designated Partnership Wild and Scenic River. The proposed restoration project entails major alterations to about 215 acres of land, with an attempt to transition the site from mature white pine oak forest to a barrens and oak woodlands community. The project involves timber harvest of about 70% of the forest, understory clearing, herbicide application, and periodic burning. The project is described as being the first of several phases. Requests for baseline surveys to substantiate the site selection have gone unanswered. The lack of data to support the restoration at this site erodes trust in agencies' decision-making processes. Governmental agencies responsible for public land have a responsibility to approach future forest management initiatives with transparency and ample opportunity for public engagement and participation throughout the process. We recognize that certain situations at specific sites are perfect for carefully executed ecological restoration to preserve rare and endangered species. We would encourage public agencies to produce a standardized set of criteria that carefully define the state's climate and land management priorities and ensure all agencies are held to an equal standard in considering selected restoration sites, and that these sites should be assessed for existing site characteristics, including ecological and recreational value, current and future carbon sequestration potential, and existing wildlife habitat values with inventories conducted by qualified professionals. The projected value of forest management efforts should be carefully measured against the potential carbon storage lost by all proposed management activities. Thank you very much for this time.
Thank you. Our next commenter is Katie Eisman.
Hi, I'm Katie Eisman. I'm a policy advisor with the Partnership for Policy Integrity. And we were glad to see that Climate Chief Hoffer's recent report had several recommendations related directly to our forests. This is entirely appropriate. And we urge this administration not to merely tinker around the edges when it comes to supporting forest ecosystems as climate solutions. At the last session, we mentioned our support for the pending legislation to grant forest reserve status to more of our public lands. Of course, the vast majority of forests in the Commonwealth are in private hands, so please dismiss the specious argument of some previous commenters who suggest that expanding forest reserves on our public lands would somehow hurt the forest products or logging industries. Climate-minded management of our public forest land should not contemplate cutting publicly owned trees for anyone's financial gain. As for private land, I won't reiterate our previous comments, but I'll add that as a starting point, rules and incentives still need to be reworked so that technological climate solutions such as solar fields and battery storage systems are built in brownfields rather than at the expense of our forests. This administration should also prioritize acquiring and permanently protecting from any logging older forested parcels that are actively threatened by development. The science is clear. Bigger, older trees sequester the most carbon. The simplest climate solution is to let them grow. Without robust protection of forests with older trees, we're kneecapping our forest's ability to live up to their real potential as climate solutions. Putting our public land off limits to logging is pretty much the least that we can do. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next commenter is Glenn Ayers.
Thank you very much. My name is Glenn Ayers. I'm a soil scientist, and I live in Greenfield, Mass. I love our state forest very much, and I often hike and camp in wild areas, the wildest areas that I can find in Massachusetts, which happen to be our state forests. But I've also been arrested by DCR in Wendell State Forest, protesting a logging operation there a few years ago, where DCR was chopping down a 120-year-old oak forest well, it was being chopped down by a private logger, which DCR permitted. Over the past 10 years, DCR has helped urban communities plant 36,000 trees, young trees, which is great. Meanwhile, DCR and DFW have chopped down over 1 million mature trees on our state-owned lands. Over that same 10-year period, over 1 million mature trees. Each mature tree is worth about 500 small trees. And so DCR and DFW, just over the past 10 years, has accumulated a 450 million tree deficit. Guidelines are not going to help balance that equation. If you look at the Adirondacks, all of the state-owned lands in the Adirondack Park, that's 50% of the total in the park. All of the state-owned lands are either forever wild forests or designated wilderness areas. That's the model that Massachusetts should adopt for our state forest lands. We should have wild forests and wilderness areas in Massachusetts. Guidelines are not going to do that for us. That needs to be done by law or by regulation. So we should be doing pro-forestation on state-owned lands, and we should have a program run by DCR to rewild our state forests. The way to do that would be for folks to support the passage of H 4150, the Forest Protection Act, that has a hearing coming up on the 29th of this month before the Environment and Natural Resources Committee. Guidelines are not going to solve the problem. They do not respond to the moratorium. Let's get real and take some serious action to address the climate emergency instead of passing some voluntary guidelines. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Our next commenter is Ann Hayes. Hi, you're muted. Is Annie Hayes there? Seems like she might have stepped away. Maybe we'll circle back to her. Let's go to Beth Melevchik. Beth, you're muted.
Hi, Beth Malofchek, Arlington, Massachusetts, home to bald eagles, coyotes, and lots of turkeys. Thank you, Undersecretary Cooper, for the opportunity to comment. I think we need wildlands, and if that designation is wild forests and wilderness areas with the model of the Adirondacks, I want to emphasize Mr. Ayers' comments, as well as Carl Jorda's, Don Ogden's, Zach Porter's, and a few others. But I feel very strongly about this. Humanity has failed the planet. We only need to listen to the General Secretary of the UN to understand that. We spent a summer watching Canada and its boreal forests burn, as well as that community on Hawaii. So Undersecretary Cooper, you're in the position of having to do the Hail Mary pass for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And I do believe you're up to it. So please do enlarge the state forests. Please do designate them or have them designated as wildlands and wilderness areas. Please do seek rulemaking, because guidelines will not be enough. They'll be seen as suggestions. We do need more transparency in addition to the rulemaking. And we won't get there alone with the additional forests. God willing, and may she be benevolent, that we can approach what New York State has accomplished with the Adirondacks Park. That I do believe is our objective, but we need the gas leak problem solved. It needs to be a multi-objective battle that we engage in for future generations, as we know that. So please work with your colleagues on Governor Healy's team and have the companies fix the gas leaks. So in my remaining seconds, I would like to say that municipalities need also to be strengthened so that we can protect our existing woodlands. We face in Arlington an upcoming struggle to preserve a forest, a woodland, Hills Hill, that's been designated and given CPA money to install a mountain biking park. But what we're concerned about is that the woods will be removed to construct a mountain biking park. So anything you can do to empower municipalities to preserve existing woodlands, pocket parks, treed areas, so that, as the former commenter mentioned about using existing buildings rather than taking down a forest in Wayland Sudbury to put up a school, the communities need you, Undersecretary Cooper, to please address this. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Next commenter is Matthew Sisk. Matthew, you're muted. There you go.
Sorry about that. Thank you. Good evening. My name is Matthew Sisk. I'm a member of the Division of Fisheries and Wildlife Board. I wanted to firstly thank the team at Energy and Environmental Affairs for this process. It's been a great one. I believe it's been transparent, and that you're all working diligently on this, as well as the full subcommittee that's working on this process. So we all know that Governor has set first in the nation biodiversity goals that the Division of Fisheries and Wildlife will be taking a large part in. I think I can speak for the entire board. I know I can speak for myself, and I'll say that we're very excited about that. And I know that the employees there are looking forward to the challenge. With that being said, I'd ask that the committee consider some small moniker of flexibility in the proposal that they put forward, so that in the event that there is a need for some sort of management in forestry, that opportunity be there, and that flexibility lend itself to some common sense, which I'm sure it will. And again, I just wanted to thank you for the opportunity to speak and the hard work that you're all doing. Good evening.
Thank you. The next speaker is Emma Ellsworth.
Emma, I apologize. I copy and pasted your name twice on the list. You can ignore the second time.
Sure. Am I on?
Yes, you are.
Okay. Hello, everybody. You have two Mass Wildlife Board members right in a row. So I also, like Matt, want to thank everybody for their hard work. And it's really exciting to see the progress that's being made and the development of the branches. And in particular, I feel like the branches really show how nuanced a process this is, for which I'm very grateful. I want to highlight a few things, particularly from the natural heritage piece. The board just had the opportunity last board meeting to review updates to our endangered species and species of special concern list. And as part of that process, we look at particular threats. And I was really taken back by how many of the species that we were adding to either of those lists where the threat was the loss of habitat, and in particular, the open space, the early successional habitat, field, grassland. And unfortunately, those particular habitats are only maintained through active management. So the threat to our biodiversity of not having management feels very real and present to me. And so I just wanted to bring that up. And I also want to bring up a second example from my own experience. I'm also executive director at Mount Graceland Conservation Trust. And we have a absolutely beautiful property where I personally walk my dogs 3 or 4 times a week. And in the last couple of years, it got impacted very heavily by a native insect called the hemlock looper. But unfortunately, that hemlock looper hit a hemlock forest that was already really negatively impacted by climate change and by an invasive pest called the woolly adelgid. So the hemlock looper has basically devastated this forest. And it is in a forever wild conservation easement. So we can't go in and manage. And I strongly believe in the Wildlands and Woodlands report and the recommendation that at the very least 5% of our conserved properties be set aside as forever wild. But I'm now in a bit of a pickle because I have several hundred acres of really standing dead hemlock. And there are a lot of trails. I'm worried about forest fire damage. I'm worried about tree falling. And I'm really worried about this mass mortality and the loss of carbon storage. So I think when we think about reserves and we think about our conservation tools, giving ourselves some amount of flexibility to adjust to impacts that are exacerbated by climate change is really imperative. And the more we lock ourselves in when we don't know what's coming down the pipeline, I think we really tie our hands. And the last piece that I want to say, and I really loved the questions, the framing of this discussion is about conservation, because I think our greatest threat to biodiversity, to carbon sequestration, to carbon storage is forest conversion. And so when we talk about how do we escalate the pace of conservation in Massachusetts, what are the tools that we have? You can imagine, I love the conversation about investing in capacity and conservation capacity, because
excuse me, Ms. Ellsworth, you're past our deadline.
Good.
All right.
Capacity.
Sorry.
Thank you so
I
much.
apologize for having to intervene there, but thank you.
Thank you.
Just want to check in. We're bumping up at our 8:30 timeline. We've got 3 more commenters, so I'm going to assume that it's okay to keep going so that we hear from everyone who's signed up.
Yes, we very much want to hear what everybody else has to say. Thank you, Susan.
Okay, thank
And
you.
noting that we've had no additional signups after this.
Okay, great. So let's go to Rick Whitney.
Hi, thank you all. My name is Rick Whitney. I'm a climate impact consultant with Carbon A-List. We work in climate advising and carbon and ecosystem markets and programs advising. And we're proud awardees of Partnership for Climate Smart Commodities grants. We're actively doing work in mitigation space. I'm also a graduate student in forest and restoration ecology. So thank you very much for providing the opportunity to comment. This is a great learning opportunity, I think, for everybody. And I appreciate everybody joining tonight and taking time out of their night to participate here. A lot of great comments so far. I'll keep my comment brief. I really just want to stress and echo a couple things I heard from Mr. Sisk and Mr. DeBona specifically, that when we talk about managing forests for carbon, this is not the same as managing for resilience. They are two different things. Resilient forest, which creates the resilient communities around them, must include biodiversity, must include genetic diversity, species diversity, ecosystem diversity, and it must include, as somebody mentioned earlier, preservation of the soils in those ecosystems and all the considerations that we need to bring to bear with regards to the biochemical and other ecosystem processes that are going to make a healthy forest. That said, I feel like a lot of the conversation so far, or at least in some of the introductory work and slides, have been around carbon sequestration and carbon strategies. This is, and probably should not be, central to this conversation. If it was, we'd be planting carbon plantations, doing monoculture for fast-growing trees that we could convert into durable wood products. I don't think that's the intention or focus of what we're talking about here. Carbon is a consequence of good forest management and not the central thesis of good forest management. So any management practices developed for carbon sequestration has to consider biodiversity as a primary goal, because without it, the forest fails. And we need to optimize carbon sequestration and storage in the context of a wide array of goals, not just the goals that we've stated around carbon. So thank you very much for your time, and have a great evening.
Thank you. Next commenter is John Clark. John, you're muted.
Here we go.
Right.
I appreciate the effort of the presenters and committee members and others involved as you attempt to adapt 120 years of forest science to address this new challenge of addressing climate change. Although I'm a forester working in the private sector and appreciate habitat, watershed, and recreational management, I'd like to simply address two issues. First, we admit that greater than 90% of our wood consumed in Massachusetts is harvested elsewhere, and that our forest products use is increasing. It's important for everyone listening to understand that Mass DCR provides the most rigorous and thorough regulation of timber harvesting of any state agency in the country. It's absolutely imperative that as responsible, environmentally conscious consumers, we use wood that is harvested here instead of outsourcing our consumption to places where little or no regulation is applied to timber harvesting. We have all seen images of the results. So I would like to suggest that we acknowledge the importance of using responsibly sourced forest products, which include wood harvested in our state. Second, we shouldn't take away the ability to manage woodlands when we are uncertain of the future of our forests. The most devastating impacts in the last 100 years have largely been due to exotic pests and diseases. Chestnut blight, Dutch elm disease, spongy moth, hemlock woolly adelgid, and emerald ash borer were all unanticipated. We should allow ourselves the ability to manage for future unanticipated pests and diseases. Although climate change through temperature increases will alter forests, the potential temperature, precipitation, and storm event intensity will never have the devastating effect that imported pests have had. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Nancy Lee Wood.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Oh, good. Okay, thank you. I don't have a prepared text, but I do want to call attention to the fact that this past summer is the hottest on record, and that water is the planet's cooling mechanism. And it's absolutely critical that we protect forests, trees, urban trees, as well as forests, for water retention, to reestablish groundwater, to get the biotic pump working so that we have a recycling of water in areas, which we absolutely need forests for. We need to be thinking critically about recharging our groundwater. We are losing massive amounts of fresh water off of the land masses of the planet. And we need to be thinking about water as seriously as we think about carbon sequestration. So I would really ask that this consideration be placed front and center along with carbon sequestration, as a primary reason for us desperately needing to protect our forests and our trees. Thank you.
Thank you. Caroline, should we go back and see if Annie Hayes is available?
Hello.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Annie. I have a 17-acre old farm with meadows and woodlands and wet meadows and forest down to the river. It's a beautiful place. I have lived in woods as my sole companions all of my life and as my psychological strength. One thing I'd like to say, I see a lot of youth watching in our community, forests being destroyed, uprooted, not clear cut, they're destroyed, and animals with them for solar. And we have to stop incentivizing that. And at the same time, I would like to incentivize developers who clear cut lots because it's much easier. And so there's fragmentation all throughout our community where there were wildlife corridors. And I have seen just, one lot, 100 trees here, 100 trees there. We're deforesting by developing and housing. And I would like to reiterate that water is what we can't live without. There's a lot of things maybe we think we can't live without, but water, it won't take long before we die. We see that in the Middle East. So when you cut down a tree and you strip mine and then you put solar panels on right above the aquifer, you are doing such grave damage. And for that to be incentivized is criminal. I would also say that without talking about population, we really are going to overrun the planet we already have. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. There were a few people who weren't present when we got to their names, so I'm going to just circle back to them and see if anyone is here and still wanting to comment. First one is Jonathan Parrott.
Oh dear.
Okay. Bill Kiley.
Oh.
Sarah Singh. Russell Richardson.
Yes.
Hi, Russell. Are you there? You're muted. Okay, it's possible that.
No.
Oh, there you are there. Okay.
Oh, good. Yes, I've been listening to an awful lot of these comments, and there's a couple of things about this and process that really puzzles me. One of them is I've been listening. I've spent many years not in Massachusetts, but one of the things I've come to realize up here, you just say the word forest management, and all sorts of people start jumping up and down, screaming, "No logging." That's the only thing that a lot of people equate when you even say the word management, and it's a little bit tough. And so, I mean, and it's because it's a very combative word to a lot of people. And the other question that I have in this whole process, you're talking about how to conserve forest land here in Massachusetts, and conservation is that's a useless word because virtually every person has their own definition of the word conservation. Open space conservation, water, wildlife, no matter what it is, conservation is kind of a totally amorphous word that doesn't tell you anything. And right now, if we're really talking about the future of the forest in Massachusetts, you ought to be talking about the actual, you really want to talk about continuing forest in perpetuity. So we're talking about perpetual forestry, perpetual forest management, because really what you want to do is you want to perpetuate a healthy forest in Massachusetts and all its values, whether it's perpetuating as parkland, a reservation, whatever it is. There's so many different aspects to forestry. And right now, everything I'm hearing, it's kind of tough to listen to because everybody's getting bogged down in these little words in their own little part of the world that they're thinking about. When the big picture is we're talking about the forest for the whole state, not just somebody's backyard and things like that. And we want to perpetuate the forest. We don't want to just make it say, because right now a lot of this is, forester do no, it's like, the doctor do no harm. Nobody can be trusted. Everybody's, there's so many things going on here, but people are attacking each other, and it's kind of a strange, vicious process that's frustrating because I know the intents are good, but I think that because of the lexicon that's being used, you're kind of hamstringing the process. And I really think that talking about perpetual forestry and perpetuating the forest has so much value in terms of what you're really looking at in all the values it has. Because right now everybody's got their own little niche. When you talk about management, everybody's got their own little niche that sticks in their head. And I've been listening to this, and it's the same thing over and over, but everybody's got their own concern and their own idea about management. But, just look at the whole forest, not just your own little backyard. And I guess that's my concern, perpetual forestry. And then what is management? Park management, wilderness. If you say no management right now, does that mean, okay, all these reservations, no forest management? So there will be nobody doing anything with invasive species. There won't be anybody doing fire protection. There won't be anybody doing anything with recreation or wildlife. You can't just say no management and say that. You mean no timber harvesting or no management whatsoever. Because right now, that's kind of the weird thing that's going on also, is there's an argument over how much or how little anybody's going to be allowed to do. So
right.
Hopefully, I'll stop there, but I hope I've thought about this a lot.
Thank you so much.
I didn't write that down, but I wrote the comments too.
Thank you so much for your comments.
Sorry I got so emotional, but well, thank you.
All right, I'm still going back. Lenore Brick. Okay, and then we had Pat S.
Oh, Pat.
Okay, that's the end of the list then. So I will hand it back to Undersecretary Cooper to give us our next steps and
Thank
closing.
you. Thank you, Susan. Well, first of all, thank you very much to everyone who chose to comment and everyone who chose to listen tonight. As always in these kind of conversations, we've heard many perspectives. I would say it was so clear that people were speaking from the heart, but also speaking from, with their brains at the same time, and speaking from their experience, and whether that be professional or whether they've studied something or just their lived experience. And that's all the perspectives are important. And what I would say about our work here and our commitment is that these are incredibly complex circumstances that we're living in, right? And this has been said very articulately through the course of the conversation. And it's not easy to say, okay, we're going to take one particular action, or this is the right thing to do. It's just, it's very multidimensional, but we're listening, we're learning, we're bringing the knowledge that we have, we're engaging with experts, we're listening to all of you. And what I can say is that we will be transparent about what we do going forward. And when we make decisions, whether that's writ large or in an individual property, explaining why it is we're doing that, and what's the information that we're relying on when we make a particular decision, what are the goals for which we're managing. All of that is incredibly important. So in terms of sort of next steps, we have here on the slides, this is the web page, which has all the information. We will be posting the comments that we receive and the survey results. We'll be posting a recording of this meeting. We'll also be posting the slides. it is most helpful to us if you submit written comment by Tuesday, November 21st, to best facilitate our consideration. We do have an option to sign up for email updates when we have updates about, whether it's a meeting or something else. You can do that on the website. And if there are other comments or questions that you have that you want to share, you can send those to guidelines@mass.gov. I would say there were a few questions that came up in the chat and the comments about process and what's happening, next with the committee. And I would say that they are working incredibly hard, and we are supporting that effort. And we anticipate we will, have the committee's recommendations and their recommended guidelines, and then, we, the state, will figure out, determine our response to that and how we move forward. And what I can say is that we will keep everyone updated about how the process unfolds and what the next steps are. So you will certainly be hearing from us. We're mindful of the time period that we set aside, the 6-month period from June to December, to work on this branch of Forest's climate solutions. And I do want to just be clear, and I think it's clear, as we talked about toward the beginning of the meeting, that some of this work is really a longer term commitment by the administration, in conservation, in helping landowners, in building out forest reserves, and building out woodlands, for that matter, as we invest in conservation across the state. So all of this is, just know that this is something to which we are very committed in the months, days, weeks, and more importantly, years ahead. So with that, I just want to, again, just reiterate our thanks to all of you for taking the time to be here with us tonight, and know that here are the ways that you can stay in touch with us, and we will stay in touch going forward. So thank you all, and have a good rest of your evening. Take care, everyone.